I am Elias Petrova, 58 years old, a former firefighter from Novosibirsk who moved to the Siberian wilderness to live alone. 10 years ago, I lost my wife and son in a house fire. Since then, I decided to leave the city behind and seek solace in nature. The Siberian winter is always harsh, but this year it's particularly unforgiving. Temperatures have plunged below -40 degrees Celsius, and an unexpected blizzard buried the entire forest under a thick blanket of snow. I've grown accustomed to solitude here, but weather like this always makes life more challenging. One morning, amidst the howling winds and biting cold, I stood by the window, gazing outside. The heavy snow covered the forest entirely, and I thought about the stockpile of supplies in the shed behind my cabin. Maybe I should check it, I said to myself, pulling on my thickest coat. I stepped outside, each footfall sinking deep into the snow. The wind cut like knives against my face, and I felt the cold seeping through every layer of clothing. When I reached the shed, I saw the door buried in snow. It took me nearly 20 minutes to clear the drift and get the door open. While I was busy with the task, I heard a strange sound from inside. "What was that?" I muttered, tilting my head to listen. It was a faint whimper, weak and desperate, like a cry for help. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the dim light from outside illuminating the dark corners of the shed. In the far corner, I saw 3 tiny creatures huddled together, trembling from the cold. "Dear God," I gasped, moving closer. 3 bear cubs, no bigger than puppies, were curled up tightly together. Their fur was matted, and their round eyes were wide with fear. I knelt down, staring at them, unable to process what I was seeing. "What are you doing here? Where's your mother?" I asked, though I knew they couldn't answer. Then I remembered a story the villagers had told me recently. They spoke of a group of poachers who had been hunting bears in this forest, harvesting their bile. Perhaps these cubs were orphans, victims of that cruel act. I sank to the ground, my heart heavy. In my eyes, these cubs were no different from helpless children begging for salvation. But I also knew the dangers of taking them in. Bears aren't animals you can keep as pets. As they grow, they would inevitably become a threat to humans. I stood up, intending to shut the door. Yet, as I turned to leave, their faint whimpers stopped me in my tracks. I turned back, my eyes filled with emotion. "All right, don't blame me later," I muttered, justifying my decision to myself. I hurried back to the cabin, rummaging through the kitchen for any leftover milk in an old blanket. Returning to the shed, I knelt near the cubs, carefully trying to feed them small amounts of milk using a clean cloth. One cub managed to take a few weak sips. The other 2 were so frail they barely reacted. "Come on, little ones. You've got to be strong," I whispered, as much to comfort them as to reassure myself. That entire day, I didn't leave the shed. I laid the blanket on the floor, lit a small fire nearby to keep them warm, and checked on their condition every few hours. I didn't know if what I was doing was right or wrong, only that I couldn't leave them to perish in the cold. That night, back in the cabin, I sat silently by the fireplace, reflecting on my decisions. I had already lost my family, and now I couldn't bear the thought of watching more innocent lives slip away. "Tomorrow, we'll figure out what to do next," I whispered, as though making a promise to the 3 little cubs lying in the freezing shed. And so, my story with these 3 extraordinary creatures began on that bitterly cold winter's day. 2 years had passed since that fateful day when I rescued the 3 bear cubs in the icy cold of a Siberian winter. Boris, Natasha, and Misha, the names I had given them, had grown enough to return to the wild by the following spring. I often wondered if they survived, if my decision back then had been the right one. But in all that time, I hadn't seen any sign of their return. Life returned to its usual solitary rhythm. It was another harsh winter day when an unexpected snowstorm struck, more ferocious than any I'd encountered before. The temperature plummeted, and the wind howled through the cracks of the cabin, making the air frigid despite the roaring fire in the hearth. I realized my woodpile was running low. Waiting a few more days would mean no firewood left to keep warm. Though I knew the risks, I had no choice but to venture into the forest to gather more. I layered up with as many clothes as I could, pulled my fur hat low over my head, and wrapped a scarf tightly around my neck. Before leaving, I grabbed a small axe and flashlight, tucking them into an old canvas bag. Just for a little while, Elias. Then get back, I muttered to myself, trying to calm my nerves. Snow fell thick and heavy, and each step sank knee-deep into the drifts. The wind whipped around me, pelting my face with icy flakes like stinging lashes. Pulling a small sled behind me, I searched for broken branches or fallen trees from the storm, doing my best to ignore how the blizzard worsened with every passing minute. I had gone farther than I'd planned, but the amount of firewood I'd gathered was disappointingly small. On my way back, I realized the most horrifying thing. The snow had completely covered my tracks. All around me was a vast, blinding expanse of white. I looked to the sky, hoping for a hint of light or something to orient myself, but it was futile. This can't be happening. Calm down, Elias, I muttered, trying to suppress the rising panic. I turned back the way I thought I'd come, but everything looked the same, a labyrinth of snow with no end. The icy wind cut through my layers, and my breath froze the moment it left my mouth. My fingers and toes began to go numb. Don't panic. Find the wind's direction, north wind. I struggled to remember my father's advice, but my mind was beginning to falter under the cold and fear. I walked and walked, but there was no sign of the cabin. Each step drained more of my strength. The snow fell heavier, the wind grew colder, and the faint light of the sun faded away entirely. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for air, every joint in my body stiff with cold. A deep, insistent urge to lie down and close my eyes forever began to creep over me. Just as I thought it was all over, a deep, low growl cut through the howling wind. "Boris?" I whispered, not sure if I was hallucinating. A large, dark shape emerged from the swirling snow. I rubbed my eyes, straining to see clearly. It was Boris, massive, powerful, his jet-black fur stark against the white expanse of snow. He approached me, his sharp eyes fixed on mine, as if assessing my condition. "Boris, is it really you?" I croaked, barely believing what I saw. Boris let out another deep roar before cautiously stepping closer. Then, from either side, Natasha and Misha appeared, both grown and as strong as Boris. I sank to the ground, tears streaming down my face, only to freeze in the bitter cold. "You came back. You really came back." Boris nudged my shoulder gently with his nose, as if urging me to stand. I struggled to my feet, my legs feeling like lead. Boris led the way, with Natasha and Misha flanking me on either side, forming a protective formation. They moved slowly, ensuring I could keep up, frequently glancing back to check on me. When I stumbled and fell, Natasha crouched down, allowing me to lean against her for support. I didn't know where they were leading me, but I felt an unshakable sense of safety. After what felt like an eternity, the familiar silhouette of my cabin appeared through the thick veil of snow. Overcome with emotion, I burst into tears, gratitude flooding my heart. Boris let out one final roar before all three bears turned and disappeared back into the forest, vanishing into the endless white. Once inside the cabin, I collapsed onto the floor, my trembling hands sparking a small fire in the hearth. Thanks to them, I had survived the storm. The creatures I had once saved had now saved me in return, without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. That spring, the snow melted, and the forest began to awaken after the long winter. I returned to my daily routine, inspecting the area around the cabin, repairing damage, and preparing for the summer. These peaceful days often made me think of the three bears. Since the snowstorm, I hadn't seen them again. Although I knew they had returned to the wild, I couldn't stop wondering if they were safe. One morning, an unusual noise came from the edge of the forest. The sound of machinery echoed through the trees, mixed with loud voices. My brow furrowed, and my heart began to race. This wasn't normal. I stepped outside, straining to see past the trees. The sight before me made me freeze. A group of men, about 6 of them, stood near large trucks. Some wielded chainsaws, marking trees with red paint, preparing to cut them down. I gripped the axe in my hand tightly, my breath heavy. "What are you doing here?" I shouted, walking closer. A tall man, seemingly the leader, turned to look at me, a sneer spreading across his face. "Old man, this is none of your business. Go back inside." "I won't let you cut down these trees. This is a protected area, not your playground for logging," I replied, trying to keep my voice firm. "Don't bother us, old man," another man chimed in, his tone laced with threat. "We're just doing our job. If you don't want trouble, go back to your cabin." I stepped back, realizing the situation was more dangerous than I had anticipated. These men weren't just equipped with machinery. One of the trucks had a rifle clearly visible on its bed. I returned to the cabin, my mind racing for a solution. I didn't have a phone to call the authorities, and even if I did, it would take hours for them to reach this remote area. A sense of helplessness washed over me. Then a thunderous roar shattered the tense silence, echoing through the forest and shaking the ground. I stepped outside, my heart pounding in my chest. Boris emerged from the shadows of the trees, his imposing figure exuding authority and power. Behind him were Natasha and Misha, moving deliberately, their eyes fixed on the loggers. "This can't be," I whispered, my gaze locked on the three bears. One of the men screamed, "Bears! Damn it, there are bears in this forest!" The group panicked, stepping back as Boris let out another deafening roar. Natasha and Misha flanked him, their presence adding to the overwhelming sense of danger. I could see the fear in the loggers' faces as they scrambled to regroup. Boris took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes unyielding, daring anyone to challenge him. The forest was alive with tension, and in that moment, I knew the tables had turned. Boris stepped closer, positioning himself between me and the loggers. Natasha moved to the right, Misha to the left, forming a triangular formation that encircled the men. Fear was etched onto their faces as they began retreating step by step. "Don't panic! Do something!" the leader shouted, but none of the men dared to act. Boris rose onto his hind legs, towering over them, before slamming his massive front paws into the ground with a resounding thud. Natasha and Misha let out deafening roars that echoed through the forest, their cries merging into a final, unmistakable warning. "Run! These bears aren't messing around!" another man shouted. The loggers broke into a frantic retreat toward their trucks. But Boris and Misha weren't about to let them leave unscathed. Natasha lunged forward, swiping her claws to overturn a barrel of fuel, spilling its contents onto the ground. Misha tore into a tire, shredding it in moments, while Boris charged at a chainsaw, toppling it with a single powerful shove. The remaining men scrambled into the last truck, desperately trying to start it. I stood frozen, watching the chaos unfold, unsure of what to do other than silently thank the three bears. When the last vehicle finally sped off and disappeared from sight, I collapsed to the ground, my body trembling with relief, cold sweat clinging to my skin despite the icy air. Boris turned to look at me, his dark eyes steady and calm, as if to say, "It's over now." I let out a laugh, half a sigh of relief, half an emotional release. "You really are heroes," I said, my voice hoarse with gratitude. The three bears lingered for a moment longer, scanning the area as if to ensure no further threats remained. Then, with deliberate steps, they turned back toward the forest and disappeared into the dense green shadows. That day, I realized I was no longer alone. Boris, Natasha, and Misha were not just the creatures I had once saved. They were my protectors, my unlikely companions, and the most extraordinary friends I could have ever hoped for. That summer, the heat was unusually intense. High temperatures and dry air blanketed the Siberian forest. I could sense the weather's strangeness, but I never expected it to be the harbinger of disaster. One afternoon, as I sat on the cabin porch, I noticed the sky gradually darkening to a murky orange. At first, I thought it was just the setting sun, but then a strong smell of smoke hit me, sharp and overwhelming. I jumped to my feet looking toward the horizon and saw a massive wildfire spreading rapidly through the forest. "This can't be happening. It's a wildfire," I exclaimed, panic surging through me. I rushed into the cabin, frantically gathering essential items, a little water, a first aid kit, and some dried food. But as I stepped back outside, I realized the wind had shifted. The fire was now racing straight toward the cabin, faster than I had anticipated. I ran to the edge of the forest, desperately searching for an escape route. But the thick smoke obscured my vision, and the searing heat from the flames felt like it was consuming everything. "No, I can't die here," I told myself, though despair was already creeping into my heart. Amidst the choking haze, a familiar sound broke through, the deep, powerful roar of a bear. I turned, straining to see through the smoke. It was Boris, charging out of the forest, his jet-black fur stark against the fiery orange glow. Natasha and Misha followed close behind. "Boris! Misha! Natasha!" I shouted, a mix of astonishment and relief filling my voice. Boris approached me, tossing his head as if to signal something. Natasha circled behind me, gently nudging my legs as though urging me to follow their lead. "You're guiding me?" I said aloud, though I didn't expect an answer. Without hesitation, Boris turned and began moving, glancing back to make sure I was following. Natasha and Misha flanked me on either side, creating a protective formation. For the first time since the fire began, a flicker of hope ignited within me. Boris led the way, with Natasha and Misha guarding my sides, just like before. But this time, their movements were more urgent. Boris navigated through winding paths, seeming to avoid dangerous areas I couldn't perceive. Every time I faltered from the heat or exhaustion, Natasha stopped, shielding me with her body so I could catch my breath. "Okay, I'm moving. You really know what I need," I murmured, my voice filled with both awe and gratitude. They led me to a shallow stream where I crouched down and splashed cold water on my face to ease the scorching heat. Boris waited on the opposite bank, watching me intently, while Natasha and Misha stood guard on either side, ever vigilant. Time passed in a blur. I had no idea how long we had been moving. My body was near its limit, but the presence of the three bears gave me the strength to carry on. Finally, through the dense smoke, I saw a large clearing, an emergency relief area where firefighters and rescue workers were tirelessly battling the blaze. "We've made it," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. Boris stopped at the edge of the safe zone, his dark eyes meeting mine as if to ensure I was truly safe. Natasha and Misha let out soft growls, almost like a farewell, before the three of them turned and disappeared back into the forest. Rescue workers rushed to support me, but my mind remained fixated on what had just happened. When I recounted the story, no one believed me, but I knew the truth of what I had seen. After the fire was extinguished and I was allowed to return to my cabin, I discovered something extraordinary. The area around my cabin had been cleared of dry leaves and fallen branches, perfectly fireproofed. While the fire had devastated everything else, my cabin stood untouched. It became clear that the three bears hadn't just guided me to safety. They had also worked to protect the place I called home. I sat down in front of my cabin, gazing at the charred remains of the forest, and whispered, "Thank you. You're not just wild creatures. You're family." After the wildfire, my cabin was no longer the same. Though it had miraculously been spared thanks to the efforts of the three bears, the surrounding land was a charred wasteland. I stood amidst the devastation, feeling both grateful and hollow. The nearby community, moved by my story, came together to help me rebuild. People arrived from all over, some bringing wood, others helping with construction. Everyone was touched by the tale of the bears. "Elias, we still can't believe what you've told us," said one of the workers while repairing the roof. "But looking at the evidence around here, it's hard to deny." "They're not just animals," I replied, my gaze fixed on the distant forest. "They're my family." When the new cabin was finally completed, I felt a sense of relief, though I couldn't stop wondering if the three bears would ever return. Every morning, I stood on the porch, looking toward the deep woods, hoping to catch sight of their familiar forms. Time passed, winter arrived, and snow blanketed the world in white once again. Then one day, in the dim light of early morning, I heard a faint sound coming from the forest. At first, I thought it might be deer or rabbits foraging, but then I saw them, three large dark shapes moving toward the cabin. Boris led the way as always, with Natasha and Misha close behind. They had returned. I stepped outside, a broad smile spreading across my face. "Boris, Natasha! Misha! You're really back!" Boris let out a soft growl, as if answering me. Natasha and Misha stayed a little farther back, their bright eyes glowing against the snowy backdrop. Boris approached closer, nodding slightly, almost as if greeting me. I raised my hand, hesitant to touch him, but the warmth in my heart was undeniable. "I knew you'd come back," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I've been waiting for you all this time." From that point on, the three bears began visiting my cabin more frequently. They never stayed long, but each time they appeared, I felt a profound sense of safety and protection. Once I saw Boris patrolling around the cabin, clawing at a tree to mark his territory. Natasha and Misha often stood at the forest's edge, watching over the area as if ensuring no intruders came too close. One day, the doctor from the village came to check on my health, As he stepped out of the cabin, I noticed the three bears standing in the distance, watching intently. The doctor turned back to me, his face pale with disbelief. "Are those bears?" he stammered. "They are," I replied with a smile. "Don't worry, they won't harm you. They're just making sure you're someone they can trust." Over time, I realized the bears weren't just returning to visit me. They were actively protecting me and the surrounding area. They became silent guardians, continually surprising me with their intelligence and loyalty. I often spotted them from afar, quietly observing, and every time I did, I felt less alone in the world. The villagers, after hearing my story and seeing clear signs of the bears around the cabin, began to shift their perception of nature. They came to understand that kindness can forge miraculous bonds, even across species. Each morning, I sat on the porch, looking out toward the forest. Even when I couldn't see them, I knew they were out there, watching over me. I spoke softly, just loud enough for myself to hear. "Thank you. You didn't just save my life. You helped me find meaning in it again." The three bears, creatures I had once saved, had now become my protectors. They weren't just repaying a debt. They had become an integral part of my life, a constant reminder that even the smallest acts of compassion can lead to extraordinary connections. Spring returned, melting the snow to reveal tender shoots sprouting from the moist earth. The forest around the cabin slowly came back to life after the long winter. Sitting on my porch with a cup of hot tea, I breathed in the crisp morning air, letting the peace settle over me. Whenever I thought about everything I had been through with the three bears, my heart swelled with emotion. They had forever changed my life. One afternoon, as I was tidying up the area around the cabin, I heard loud noises coming from the forest. The sound of branches snapping and heavy footsteps crunching over dry leaves reached my ears. I stopped what I was doing and looked up, smiling uncontrollably when Boris appeared, followed by Natasha and Misha. "You've come to visit me again, haven't you?" I laughed, my voice full of excitement. "I knew it. You don't have to hide all the time." Boris approached me, his familiar gaze meeting mine, as if he wanted to convey something. Natasha and Misha stayed a few steps behind, silently observing. I raised my hand, not to touch Boris, but to acknowledge the bond between us that needed no physical contact. "All right, I understand. I'm fine. There's nothing to worry about," I said, as if reassuring them. "But I'm glad you still remember me." The three bears stayed longer than usual, wandering around the cabin and inspecting every corner like loyal guardians. I felt comforted and protected, a sense of companionship that was both grounding and uplifting. I spent the entire afternoon sitting on the porch, watching them move through the quiet forest. After that visit, they continued to show up regularly, though not always within view. Many times, while checking the area around the cabin, I would find traces of them, large paw prints pressed into the ground, claw marks scored into tree trunks. I knew, even when I couldn't see them, that they were there, silently watching over me. One day, a group of journalists and scientists arrived at my cabin, eager to interview me and study the unique bond between me and the three bears. They brought cameras, recording equipment, and a flurry of questions. "Mr. Elias, how do you explain this?" one journalist asked. "The idea of three wild bears protecting and interacting with a human like this is truly unprecedented." I chuckled, taking a sip of tea before answering. "I don't think I need to explain anything. We just helped each other. When I saved them, I didn't expect anything in return, but somehow they came back and gave me more than I could have ever given them." A scientist nodded thoughtfully. "Their behavior goes far beyond typical instincts. This is a story of intelligence, gratitude, and a bond that transcends species." After that visit, my story and the bears became widely known. It appeared in newspapers, on television, and even in documentaries. But for me, the most important thing was that the three bears were still here, still a part of my life. Each morning, as the first rays of sunlight streamed through the forest, I would step onto the porch, close my eyes, and breathe in the fresh air. I never knew if I would see them that day, but it didn't matter anymore. I knew they were out there, somewhere close, silently watching over me and the forest they called home. I looked out toward the forest and smiled softly. "Boris, Natasha, Misha, thank you. I don't know where I would be without you, but you've taught me something important. kindness is never forgotten. My story isn't about miracles or extraordinary phenomena. It's simply a story about compassion, a small act of kindness that returned to me, larger, more beautiful, and more powerful than anything I could have ever imagined.